So here we're just going to be identifying, right? Well, we're going to be looking at topics such as natural selection and speciation and relating it to evolution, right? Generally Darwinian evolution, right? So let's have a brief look at what I love to call evolutionary biology, right? So the Darwinian theory of evolution, what we're basically speaking about now is what comes from the term or the school of thought that is called Darwinism, right? So this revolutionized our understanding of the natural world, right, and our place within it. Published in its seminal work on the origin of species in 1859, Darwin's theory proposed a mechanism for how species change over time through the process of natural selection, right? Going to be looking at that. So natural selection in and of itself, right? At the heart of Darwin's theory is the concept of natural selection. This process occurs when individuals within a population possesses rather variations in traits that affect their survival and reproductive success. Right? So these variations can be inherited over time, right? Well, inherited and over time, individuals with advantageous traits will be more likely to survive and pass on survival of the fittest, right? So with the more advantageous traits, right, you'll be more likely to survive and pass on those traits to the next generation, right? This results in the gradual accumulation of beneficial traits within a population, leading to evolutionary change. All right. We're also looking at the key things under variation. Variation is a key component of natural selection. Individuals within a population exhibit differences in traits such as size and color and behavior, right, and stuff like that, right? So these variations can arise through genetic mutations, genetic recombination in the case of, well, let's just leave that there, and during sexual reproduction and environmental influences, right? So variations can provide the raw material upon which natural selection really acts, right? It's the main thing that drives natural selection, and natural selection is the main thing that drives evolution. All right. Overproduction and competition, right? Natural populations often produce more offspring than the environment can support. So this leads to the competition for limited resources such as food and water and mates, right? Only a fraction of the offspring will survive to adulthood and reproduce, with those possessing advantageous traits having a higher chance of survival. So what we're looking at is the different things, right, that ties into Darwin's theory of evolution, right, and how these things drive changes in speciation and evolution, right? So in the case of overproduction, we have so many organisms that the environment cannot support. Therefore, naturally, only the ones with the better traits will survive, right, and carry on those traits, right, to the next generation, right? So these results in the differential survival, so only some will survive, and the reproduction of individuals driving evolutionary change, right? As only one subset will continue to propagate, and that subset will become more different as generations changes and develop into new species or into new evolutionary pathways. All right. We also have adaptation, which is a very important thing here, right? So looking at the peppered moth here, through the process of natural selection, populations become adapted to their specific surroundings, their environments over time. Adaptations are traits or characteristics that increase the organism's fitness or its ability to survive and reproduce in a particular environment, right? That's really what it is. So if you adapt, it's usually going to be some type of structural, physiological, or behavioral change, right? But if you live in a specific environment, your adaptation would be the thing that you changed or the change that occurred for you to better be suited to that environment to increase what we call the fitness of the organism, all right? And that would be its adaptation. All right. Is everything fine thus far? We're just discussing the information. Remember, if there's a question, please do ask. Okay? Everything is fine thus far? All right. We're also looking at within Darwinism, within the theory of evolution, we're looking at the fact of common descent. The thing is, no, a lot of persons like to say, oh, it's just a theory. No, it's actually factual evidence backing up all of this. So, right. it is factual, right? But it's called a theory because it's actually tested and proven through scientific rigor. Because there's difference in what we call a regular theory or a scientific theory. It's called theory, but to the layman, it just seems like a guess. It's not a guess, right? It has to go through a lot of rigor to be called a theory in science, right? So Darwin's theory also proposes, right, that all living organisms are related through common descent from a common ancestor. This means that all organisms, from bacteria to humans, share one common evolutionary history, right, within the tree of life. So this is the biological tree of life that we're talking about, right, where we see the different domains, right? So from domains we get kingdoms, and from kingdoms we get phylums going down, right? These are the major domains that we're looking at. Bacteria, archaea, and eukarya, right? We belong in eukarya, right? I'm believing that most stuff, if not everybody on the call right now, belongs to the domain eukarya, right? But looking at, right, the common descent principle, right? We're looking at that fact that the diversity of life on Earth is a result of evolutionary processes acting over billions of years, with new species arising through the gradual accumulation of change over time, right? So we have this tree of life, right? It's usually used in microbiology a lot, right? So we have there, and we have here what is called Luca, the last universal common ancestor, which combines all the domains together. All right, lovely. Now let's have a look at the underpinnings of evolutionary biology, right? So we're gonna be looking at this now, the survival of the fittest, natural selection. Could somebody describe to me what natural selection is, even though we briefly described it already? In your with your understanding, in your mind, what does natural selection talk of? What does survival of the fittest
Um,
mean? Go ahead.
it basically means that the organisms who have the favorable traits to withstand the favorable environments would survive.
Right, so we have favorable traits, right, to survive in specific environment. Right, so we have that there. So lovely. Natural selection and environmental factors as selective pressures. So we know that natural selection is a fundamental driving force, right, or a fundamental mechanism of evolution, whereby organisms with advantageous traits, right, as was mentioned a while ago, right, are more likely to survive and reproduce, leading to the gradual change of populations over time, right? So we're gonna have shifts in the populations, right, over time, as we know that the advantageous traits become more frequent, right? So environmental factors play a crucial role in the shaping the process of natural selection by acting as selective pressures that favor certain traits over others, right? So when we're looking at the biotic and the abiotic factors, right, that influence, right, the selection. Well, these factors are what we call selective pressures, right? So let's look at one selective pressure here. We're looking at different selective pressures. So let's look at the bacterial resistance to antibiotics, right? So what happens here? How can this lead to variation? How can this be natural selection, right? Bacterial resistance to antibiotics, right? Now, just to give a scenario specifically, there is a major issue, right, as it relates to the use of antibiotics generally, right? Almost everything nowadays, right, we always prescribe some amount of antibiotic, right? Oh, you have a cold antibiotic, oh, you have a scratch, oh, an antibiotic, etc., right? But what happens when we continue to use our antibiotics, right? What we're doing is destroying majority of the bacterial population, right? They will kill all the bacteria that is susceptible to the antibiotics, but will leave behind resistant bacteria, right? Which will now proliferate via binary fission, right? And then after a while, now a general population will become immune to the antibiotic, creating resistant bacteria, right? So over time of repeated exposure to antibiotics can lead to the proliferation of resistant bacteria, rendering antibiotics less effective, or in sometimes we can call them useless, right? So technically, humans are a very important driving force for the natural selection of bacteria. Because as we continue to use antibiotics, we continue to strengthen and create more dangerous bacteria, right? Because all the tricks in our book, the bacteria are just learning them, right? Just well, they're technically just learning them, right? Majority of them are dying off, and then they are going to now reproduce with traits that will basically defeat our entire playbook of antibiotics, right? So we need to continue to research new antibiotics as these bacteria continue to vary, continue to evolve into different strains, right? So we could look at something like that. For example, the common cold, right? The common cold generally so far, right, continues to mutate and continues to create different variations of itself, right? So we could link this to different types of diseases and bacterial infections as well, right? So this is one of the driving forces, right? So an example of a pressure could be the use of antibiotics, right, that will drive, right, the proliferation of antibiotic resistance, right, bacteria. Okay. In Biston betularia, or what we call the peppered moths, right? Something that we've been seeing from CSEC. But I'm pretty sure this is in the CSEC biology textbook. Cleared it from front to back. So this is in the book, right? And we're taking this concept as well, right? In this case, now, what would be the selective pressure? The selective pressure itself would actually be a biotic factor. It would actually be predation, right? So predation would be actually the selective pressure, right? In a way. Okay. So we're knowing that there's a moth population and there are going to be birds that will attack the moths, right, or whatever, right? And before industrial revolution, most of the peppered moths would just be a white color, right? Because if you can look at the tree, the bark that they're on, it would just generally be looking white, right? As a camouflage mechanism against lichens, right? Covered tree trunks, right? So we're protecting against different types of predation, right? However, after industrialization, right, it led to a lot of pollution, right, and the prevalence of the color black, right? So dark colors actually cover the tree trunks in soot, right? And now, because they're all covered in soot and the trees start to appear darker, right, it would be easier to prey on the white moths. Therefore, the ones with darker pigmentation tend to survive to maturity, right? Because they were more easily camouflaged, right? And they were able to actually carry on their traits to the next generation. So after a while, we started to see the prevalence of darker colored moths, leading to an increase in their frequency in the population. So this shift in moth coloration is an example of directional selection, and we're going to speak about that selection, right? So this is an example of a selective pressure, right? So predation, right? Specifically, what we're trying to do is to reduce predation by camouflaging, right? And because of the different environmental effects, right, environmental factors, right, it creates a newly preferred trait, a more advantageous trait, which in this case would have been the darker colors. Therefore, we're going to have the higher frequency of darker colored moths appear in the population, right? I'm hoping that it is making sense. Hoping that it is making some sense, right? But I know if it never made any sense, you guys would have probably asked something or asked me to wait and go back and explain. So yeah. So in the case of Trinidadian guppies now, so another example from the syllabus, right? So in streams, right, inhabited by the Trinidadian guppies, predation pressures varies, right, depending on the presence of the predatory fish, right? So in streams with high predation, guppies exhibit drab coloration, right? A mature later coloration and mature later, investing more energy, right, into growth and reproduction to compensate for high mortality rates, right? So what we're looking at here is that the mature guppies, right, started to get this lower drab coloration, right, in order to basically capitalize, right, on actually reproduction and growth, right? So the coloration and those type of things, right? They moved away from high coloration and generally stuff like that to focus more on growth and reproduction, right? To compensate for the high mortality rates. So basically, what we're saying is that they produce more offspring to compensate for the mortality rate. So since mortality rates are so high, they produce tons of offspring, right? In contrast, in streams with low predation, guppies display a bright coloration, right, and mature earlier, right? Investing less energy in growth and more in reproduction. So these differences, right, in life history traits are adaptations to predation pressure, right? So what we're looking at here now, right, is that the difference in predation will actually change how the guppies would react in different environments, right? So that's generally what we're looking at. So the pressure here would be predation. In some streams, there's higher predation. In some streams, there's lower predation, and the guppies actually adapt in those instances, right? So predation would be the selective pressures there, right? One of the last examples from the syllabus here would be the anole lizards, right? The Dominican anole lizards, right? So on the Caribbean island of Hispaniola, the Dominican anole lizard exhibits different limb lengths depending on habitat structure, right? So what we're saying that in here now is that in habitats with narrow perches, right? So we're looking at the structures of the habitats, the arboreal environment that they live in. Lizards with shorter limbs have a selective advantage as they can maneuver more effectively. Conversely, in habitats with broader perches, right, lizards with longer limbs have a selective advantage as they can cover greater distances more easily. So this illustrates how environmental factors such as habitat structure can affect can act as selective pressures, right? Driving evolutions of limb length with the anole lizards through natural selection. So depending on the environment on the same island on Hispaniola which they live, right? Some have longer limbs than some to really adapt to their environment, right? So that's what's happening in that case of lizards. So what we're doing is basically just using different scenarios, right, to just look at how different things change and how organisms adapt to those changes, right? So that's generally what we're looking at. Okay. Now we're looking at natural selection now as an agent of constancy or change, right? So how does natural selection allow for a population to remain constant, right? And how can natural selection actually allow for a population to change, right? This must be taken into consideration, right? Um, with the context of traits under selection, right? So the context of the trait and how selection, right, or selective pressures causes constancy or change, right? So what we're looking at now, how can natural selection maintain the stability of traits? That's what constancy speaks to. If it what causes us to retain the same traits? In some animals, no. Some animals still have the same traits that they had 100 years ago, right? So how can natural selection maintain the stability of traits within a population, right? What we're looking at now, if the environment remains relatively constant over time, right? In stable environments, right, individuals with traits that are well suited to the surroundings will be more likely to reproduce, leading to the preservation of these traits, right? So let's say that we have let me see. Let's say that we have a rainforest, right? And the rainforest hasn't changed for over 1 million years, right? Organisms within that rainforest that are well suited to the rainforest have no reason to change, have no reason to adapt, have no reason to create new traits, right? Because the environment that they're living in, they're already adapted to it. So within stable environments, right, natural selection will maintain the suitable traits. This process is known as a stabilizing selection, right? And we're going to be looking at how that works. Okay? How is it an agent for change, right? We can drive evolutionary change when the environmental conditions shift or when new selective pressures emerge, right? So if we look at something like climate change specifically, right? Climate change is going to actually affect the world in such a way in which organisms will actually have to adapt quickly, and if you cannot adapt quickly enough, the organisms will become extinct, right? So in the case of ocean acidification, the coral reefs, right, the animals such as corals can't really adapt so quickly to the fast change in their environment, so they will die off, right? But some organisms now, right, who can actually adapt fast enough, right, and actually will create new traits fast enough for them to survive, right? So under these circumstances, individuals will retain advantageous traits, or that, well, with certain advantageous traits, right, may have increased fitness, leading to the spread of those traits throughout the population over time, right? And this can result in directional selection, right? So what we're saying is that if the environmental factors change, right, then our what would be considered the fittest traits, right, would actually change, or the advantageous traits would actually change, right? So traits that were once advantageous in a previous environment will no longer be advantageous as the environment changes. So that is how natural selection can actually be an agent for change, right? So we're gonna be looking at this stuff, right? We're gonna be looking at the three main ways that we can have natural selection, right? So this entire section is really just about natural selection. So the first type of selection we'll look at is directional selection, right? So in this case now, right, there is some amount of selective pressure, right, that is causing the one extreme of the population to become more advantageous. So what we're looking at is that the fact that there's selection pressure that we're undertaking, the selection pressure that is there, right, actually selects against one extreme, right? So since it selects against one extreme, right, that means it will prefer, right, the next extreme, right? So in this case now, what we're saying is that individuals with phenotypes at one extreme of the distribution in the population have further fitness than with phenotypes of the opposite extreme, or the average, right? So this results in a shift in the frequency of a trait over time towards a favored phenotype. An example of directional selection is the evolution of antibiotic resistant bacteria, right? So as antibiotics are applied, bacteria with resistant genes have a selective advantage and become more prevalent in the population. So what we're saying is that generally within the population, right? So let me get the pen. Generally within the population, we have an average amount, right? So we have a general average here, right? If there's some amount of pressure, right, for example on this extreme, right, over here in this region over here, in this extreme, there are traits within the bacteria themselves that allow them to to easily succumb to antibiotics, right? They are going to die off. So over time, we're going to see the prevalence of bacteria, right, that have this extreme trait over here. So if there's some selective pressure that selects against one extreme, what we're going to see there is that the members of the population will decrease, right, in that extreme, and then majority of the population now will have the favored trait, or another extreme, right? So what we're looking at there is that, right? So the population, original population, right, and the population after selection. So there's something in the environment, there's some abiotic factor, there's some biotic factor, right, that allows for one extreme to be more favorable over the other. So we have a directional selection, and what that means is that we select in a specific direction. So notice that direction goes over to the right. It's a directional selection as the entire population shifts to one extreme, right? So that's what we're talking about there. For disruptive selection now, right, it occurs when individuals with phenotypes at both extremes, right, of the distribution are higher fitness than those in the intermediate phenotypes, right? So this can result from the formation of distinct phenotypic clusters within the population. So one example could be one example of disruptive selection could be of African seed cracker finches, right? So in this case, though, the organisms with either small or large beak sizes are favored over um, the different sizes, right? Will favor for cracking different sizes of seeds, right? Leading to coexistence of two distinct peak morphs within the population. What we're basically talking about, right, is that if there are two different types of seeds that are found within the environment for these birds, right? If you have a large beak, that will assist you with cracking certain seeds, right? If you have a smaller beak, that will help you to pierce certain seeds, right? But if you just have, right, the average beak size, right, that won't be advantageous, right? So what we're doing is selecting against the norm or against the average, right, traits, right? Therefore, both extremes will be favored, right? And the average will not be favored. And that is what we have. That is what we call disruptive selection. When both extremes are favored over the average, right? So notice I'm explaining to you what the selections are, right? So that's what's happening there. In the case of stabilizing selection now, we know that we now select against both extremes and now the average is actually what is preferred, right? So in humans, we can see stabilizing selection. So an example of stabilizing selection is birth weight in humans, where babies born with an average weight have higher chances of surviving rather than babies who have a large birth weight or have a very small birth weight, right? So we're looking at oversized infants, right, that are just born, birth rates right there, birth weight, right? If you have an oversized birth weight versus premature children that have a very under sized birth weight, right? So those children tend not to survive, right, compared to the ones with the average birth weight. So what's happening here is that in this type of selection, stabilizing selection, we select against both extremes and favor the average. All right, so that is what's happening there. Are there any questions or concerns as it relates to directional selection, disruptive selection, or stabilizing selection? Any questions? No? All right. Seems like everything is fine, but you guys can ask questions after if you feel more comfortable then. All right. For evolution now, our syllabus asks us to look at the underpinnings of evolution using natural selection, right? So evolution via natural selection is the process by which populations of our organisms, right? And we know that we talk about selective pressure. So whatever selective pressure may be present at whatever time and causes variation in natural selection. And now these populations will change over time. Whether or not it's a directional or a disruptive or a stabilizing change, they will change over time. And it begins with inherent variation within the population and operates through the differential survival and reproduction of individuals with the advantageous traits. Natural selection acts as a mechanism for the prevalence of these traits, leading to the adaptation and accumulation of genetic changes over generations. What we're saying is that we change very little, right? So at this time, now we've changed very little. The change may be very small, but over a millennia, over thousands of years, right, we will start to see the emergence of new species and evolution of one species into a new form. So through directional, disruptive, and stabilizing selection, populations evolve in response to environmental pressures, ultimately resulting in the diverse array of life forms that are observed on Earth. Right? And what we're generally here looking at now, this diagram here just looks at the evolution of Homo sapiens, right? Looking at there, right? Generally from the Australopithecus afarensis, right, going up to what we call the Homo sapien, which is you and I, right? So evolution takes time as selective pressures changes us over millions of years. New species arise, right? And one general species may develop into a new phase, right? So that is what we're looking at here. Any questions or any concerns? Okay, and to be very truthful, humans, in the case of how we know them, haven't really been around for that long. Like we haven't really been around for that long, We've only been around for like a couple thousand years, couple million years. We're probably a couple million years, right? In how, right, we are formed as Homo sapiens, right? So things like Homo erectus have existed for much longer time periods than we have existed. But hopefully we can, exist in our form before, we change or evolve into a completely different species. But obviously, nobody in our entire generation, right, or for thousands of years to come will ever be able to actually witness evolution, right? Evolution takes place over millions of years. All right. So speciation now. Let's look at speciation and the origin of species themselves, right? So these are just two bonobos. So I just like the picture of them, so I just put them there, right? Because people think that this is a chimpanzee. They're not chimpanzees. These are bonobos. They're different, right? How are they different? They look really similar, don't they? Because they're really close in the evolutionary timeline, right? And bonobos are actually one of the closest relatives evolutionary to humans, right? Because they have similar intelligence, not at the rate at which we have human intelligence, right? But their intelligence work really uncannily very similar to ours, right? Very, very similar, right? But let's look at the biological species concept, right? The biological species concept was proposed by Ernest Meyer in 1942 and defines a species as a group of populations, right, whose members have the potential to interbreed in nature and produce viable fertile offspring, but are reproductively isolated from other such groups. That is what he was saying. That is what Professor here was saying, right? Or Doctor, right? That is what he was saying. So Dr. Meyer was saying, Mayer, right? So he was saying that species are defined upon these core principles: the fact that they can interbreed, right? Produce viable and fertile offspring, and are reproductively isolated. These are the key things that define what a species are. Okay. So look at the interbreeding potential. Members of a species are capable of interbreeding with one another in their natural habitats. Right? Some animals actually, some species actually don't want to breed, right? Specifically if they're not in their natural habitat. So I think in their natural habitat would be one of the main proponents of this entire concept of species, right? So they're able to interbreed within their natural habitat, and this means that individuals within a species can mate and produce offspring under normal ecological conditions. All right. There's also some amount of reproductive isolation now. Species are reproductively isolated from other groups, meaning that they do not typically interbreed with individuals from other species. I mean, we can have the example of the mule where you have a horse and a donkey, but what we're looking at is the fact that they don't typically, right, interbreed with other species. So this isolation can occur through various mechanisms, including the geographic barriers, temporal isolation, behavioral differences rather, and physiological barriers. We're gonna talk about all of these things, right? As well as general incompatibility of gametes. We're gonna talk about these things, right? That's what's happening there, right? We have to have viable fertile offspring as well. So species have to have viable fertile offspring. So when members of a species do interbreed, right, they produce viable fertile offspring. So this means that offspring are capable of surviving and reproducing, ensuring the continuation of the species. Right? So in the case of a mule, to my knowledge, at the current moment in time, I've never heard of a mule producing another mule. Mules are generally not fertile, right? So mules can be produced, but they're not fertile, right? So that would actually defeat the entire purpose there. So mules, right, are not fertile. Therefore, donkeys and horses are not the same species, even though they interbred, right? Their offspring is not fertile, so they're not the same species, all right? So I have that there. So then, what is a species? Right? So this is our huge definition of what a species is, right? So species, as I said, is a group of organisms whose members are capable of interbreeding in nature and producing viable fertile offspring while being reproductively isolated from other such groups. Full stop. That is what species are. right? And we're gonna now be looking at the reproductive isolation efforts that really cause or drive speciation, the different types of speciation, allopatric and sympatric speciation. Okay, so let's look at the mechanisms of isolation, the pre-zygotic and the post-zygotic, right? So generally, that what we speak about is the pre-zygotic isolation mechanisms, right? That are put in the syllabus, right? So the first thing that is in the syllabus would have been the geographic isolation mechanisms, right? So geographic isolation occurs when populations are physically separated by barriers such as the mountains, rivers, and bodies of water. Over time, isolated populations may evolve distinct adaptations due to their different environmental pressures, leading to genetic different divergences and the formation of new species. For example, right, the an example is the formation of the Galapagos finches, right, where different island populations evolve unique beak shapes adapted to their specific food sources, right? We also have across the Caribbean islands, right? We have geographic isolation of different species across Caribbean islands, right? Where we're going, our islands develop individual species, right? Because at one point in time they were all connected, and now at this point in time there is a sea barrier, water barrier separating Caribbean islands and mainland territories, allowing for isolation efforts. But geographic isolation can also occur at smaller levels. For example, within the country of Jamaica, northern Jamaica, generally around that area, um, northwest, right, Jamaica, the cockpit country, right, on different hills. The cockpit country is what we call a prairie. So a prairie has multiple hills and divots and dives, right? On different tops of different hills, you have different species emerging as we know it, right? So speciation is occurring, right, within our time period, right? So we're looking at that the fact that if there are any type of geographical isolations, right, we can have speciation occurring, right? Behavioral isolation as well. So behavioral isolation occurs when differences in mating behaviors prevent individuals from different populations from successfully mating with each other. So this can include differences in courtship rituals, mating calls, and other behaviors rather involved in the mating selection, right? So, for example, the blue-footed booby species on the Galapagos Islands performs elaborate courtship displays. So, I'm not sure if you guys used to watch Blue Earth with David Attenborough, right? Narrating, these different documentaries, right? If you look at mating calls done by birds and dances and stuff like that, right? Those behaviors are a part of courtship that help them to mate, right? So if one style of courtship doesn't work, right, then there will be no mating and you will not carry on your offspring to the next generation. So there can be behavioral isolation, right? So in that case, no, right, these birds would actually have courtship displays that are specific to their species, ensuring mating only occurs in individuals of the same species, right? So we have that their behavioral isolation. Okay. Just like humans have different types of courtship and rituals and stuff like that that they do, right? What do you think dating is and stuff like that? All they are biological components, right, of our natural innate need to court as mammals, right? Because mammals do these things as well, and that is just one of our courtship behavioral isolation traits that humans display, right? And different humans actually display different things, but that does not mean that we are different species, because we know what a species is, right? The minute we start to call different humans different species, that's what we call racism. All right, so let's look at temporal isolation. Temporal isolation, right? Temporal means time, it speaks about time, right? So temporal isolation occurs when populations reproduce at different times, so such as different seasons or different times of day as well. So even if populations live in the same area, they may not interbreed due to the differences in timing. So this can lead to genetic divergence and formation of new species as well. An example is the North American tree frogs, where some species breed in the early spring, while others breed in late spring, preventing hybridization between them. So preventing any type of species homogeneous species between them. So they are different species, right? And that's off of temporal isolation. Like even with plants as well, that's why you have different types of seasons. You have different types of fruit seasons, right? So somehow within those times there are different mating seasons and different sexual reproductive seasons for plants as well. So there are some amount of temporal isolation existing there for plants, right? And after a long period of time, the plants now are unable to reproduce with each other. So now when they meet in the same season, right, you won't see a mango tree and a tomato plant creating a new species. It was creating offspring. That won't happen because they are two different species. They have gamete incompatibility, right? So it won't actually work, right? Because pollen of different species land on stigmas of different species all the time, but that does not mean, right, that they're going to create a hybrid because they are different species. All right. So let's look at this now. The types of speciation. We only have two types of speciation, right? We have allopatric speciation, right? So allopatric speciation speaks to populations that are geographically isolated. So over time, genetic differences accumulate between isolated populations due to independent evolutionary pressures, right? So eventually, if reproductive isolation mechanisms evolve, right, the populations may become reproductively incompatible, leading them to form into two different distinct species. So what we're saying, if there's isolation between a group for too long, they will actually diverge into different species, and that is what speciation is speaking about, right? An example of this would be the African cichlid fish, right, in East African lakes, right? So because they're divided now into different lake regions, right? Because they are geographically distant, right? They actually form into multiple species adapted to different habitats within their specific lakes, right? Across East Africa. Okay, and we have sympatric speciation. Sympatric now speaks to speciation that occurs within the same geographical area. So there's no geographical isolation, but speciation occurs anyways. So instead of reproductive isolation mechanisms, right, being evolved, right, with single populations, right, okay, let me just re say that phrase, right? Instead, reproductive isolation mechanisms evolve within a single population, right? So we're not looking at them in separate populations that are geographically distant, right? But within the same population existing in the same place, speciation can also occur. So it's often due to factors such as niche specialization or disruptive selection, right? So this can lead to the formation of new species within the same geographic area. An example would be the apple maggot fly, right? Where populations, right, that specialize, right, on different host plants within the same area have diverged into distinct species due to the differences in host preference and mating behaviors, right? So even though they're in the same area, one group has a different host plant than the others, and one group have different mating behaviors than others. But even though they're in the same area, the same geographical location, they will diverge into two different species because of that isolation. All right. So that is really it. All right. If we're going to talk about post-zygotic mechanisms, that's basically just talking about sex incompatibility and stuff like that, right? We can have discussions about that. Right, but that's basically it, covering all the sections of the syllabus that speaks about natural selection, speciation, and of course, evolution. And that is it, folks, for our look into evolutionary biology. All right.